The pines leaned over the road like cathedral columns, their needles whispering in a wind that smelled of resin and cold earth. November had thinned the daylight, and the hills around Snowflake and Heber held a gray patience, scrub, scrubby grass, and the faint geometry of man-made clearings where men stacked trunks like cordwood. The logging crew's pickup, caked with dust and sawdust, rattled along a dirt track with the kind of comfortable noise that belongs to hands that work with rope and chain, not with schedules and fluorescent lights. Inside, laughter and cigarette smoke argued with the tired groove of the day's work. Travis Walton leaned against the cab, arms bare to the chill, a cigarette pinched between two fingers. He was young, more bone than muscle, with a jaw that squinted at the world like a man who trusted his right hand to solve most problems. There were calluses on his palms, a scar on the knuckle of his left index from a wire that had snapped months before. Small maps of life lived outdoors. He had a knack for fixing what was broken, and a restlessness that made him talk when others wanted silence. Where the others in the crew found humor in routine, Travis found questions at the edge of the day. Mike Rogers drove. Short as a man could be, and somehow still the kind of driver who seemed to know the limits of a narrow road by instinct, Mike had a boss's eye for detail and a driver's patience. Dwayne, Ken, Steve, John, Alan, names that looped around the cab like a chorus, made the space between them alive with a shorthand of jokes and small grievances. They had been a unit for months, a temporary family made of lunch pails and cigarette breaks. The work had blurred the days into a simple ledger: cut, load, haul. By dusk, the crew had finished a run that left them with the small, quiet victory of a job done. They turned away from the logged slope and followed the track back toward the highway, lights from the pickup cutting the dusk into manageable pieces. The forest held its breath in the way only a pine forest can. Sounds softened by massed trunks, a dimming that felt like a promise. The men began to trade stories about girls and trucks and things that had happened to neighbors. Their laughter folded into the engine's rhythm. Then the clearing appeared. It was not a clearing like those scored by axes and sunlight, not a place where stumps sat like exclamation points. It was a bowl of trees opened to a light that had no immediate origin. At first, it was the wrong kind of white, too clean, too flat, then a color like mercury bleeding into blue. The men fell quiet because not laughing felt like the only sensible response to a thing that made the world seem briefly misfiled. The beam that lay over the clearing did not strike like lightning, but settled like a hand shaping an impression. Travis stared. For a few long seconds, the only other sounds were the cheap radio's soft hum and the tire's gravel whisper. He had felt strange touches of curiosity before, pulls he could not explain, but this was a gravity that had nothing to do with the earth. The light seemed to pull at the moisture in the air and to create a sheen on the bark of the pines. There was a noise beneath it, a pressure in the teeth, a hum that the chest registered before the ears could name it. Mike stopped the truck. Men like Mike stopped for the way the road went, not often for the way the world rearranged itself. "What the hell is that?" someone said, the voice small in the cab. Someone else clicked the flashlight on and shined it toward the clearing. The beam cut across a rounded object parked at the center like some enormous dropped coin. It cast no shadow the way ordinary things do. It seemed to generate its own atmosphere. They argued in one of those brief, practical ways that men who spend the day moving wood argue. Points and counters about whether to get closer, whether to call it in, whether to move. For Travis, the usual rules felt thin. He was the one who climbed down off the bumper with a cigarette and walked toward the brightness, the same itch in him that had sent him into cold rivers to fish and onto roofs to fix antennas. Up close, the object hummed, and the hairs on his forearms stood up, not with fear at first, but with a sharp, attentive wonder. The panels of the craft had a seam that was not a seam, like a skin that remembered being curved. When something that does not belong to the world occupies your sight, the brain attempts to classify it. Failing that, it spins stories. The men circled. Someone said, "Drill."
Someone else said satellite, and Dwayne swore it was a prank. Then the beam came, exact and terrible as a surgeon's focus. It reached through the clearing like a column of concentrated day. It hit the dirt, hit the leaves, hit Travis. The beam did not feel hot. If anything, it felt like an insistence, an alignment of the body's internal compass with an outside law. It moved through him with the clinical certainty of a thing that had done this before, with no violent tearing but with an immediate, profound removal. Travis felt his legs give way, as if the world had been asked to retire him from his place of living mechanics and breathe him into a space where ordinary balance did not apply. His cigarettes fell to the soil. The last thing he saw, before the world tilted, was Mike's face, open-mouthed, eyes blown wide, and the truck door ajar like a stage left undone. When he was gone, the truck lurched. The men shouted, a broken chorus. Panic is a rapid.
Animal utility. Where thought is not, bodies must move. They ran toward where he had stood. The soil was undisturbed. No trampled evidence of a struggle, no smear of blood, no trace that would anchor hypothesis to body. Only the imprint of a man in a moment of being, empty. They drove then in a noise made of fear, not engine bother. Mike's hands clenched at the wheel as if to screw the truck into the road. "We gotta go back," someone said. They circled the clearing like wolves who had lost one of their pack. They called to Travis, names thrown into the dusk as if sound could stitch absence. They saw weird impressions on the soil, radiant marks, patterns like the echo of a wheel, and, in the headlight glare, a scorched strip where the beam had touched. Returning to town, they ran into the arithmetic of small communities. The sheriff, volunteers, helicopters sweeping under the pall of night. The days that followed were a ledger of searches and of absence. Men and women with flashlights made concentric rings through the trees. Breath fogged in the cold. Dogs strained at leashes that could not find a scent. Neighbors offered blankets and coffee, hands reaching out to steady the men who had been out with Travis. They wanted facts, wanted to translate fear into something manageable. In those days, rumor walked like a second shadow, tiptoed into the diner, and then spread into country and cable. 5 days passed. On the 5th day, a gas station in Heber became a little hub of stunned motion. A payphone rang. A worker reached for it, thinking perhaps of prank calls or a wrong number, and the voice on the other end did not seem like a joke. "I'm at a payphone out on Highway 260, the voice said, the sound small and raw. "Tell my wife I'm okay." The local man listened, eyes widening as a private calendar reconfigured itself. He called the sheriff. Travis walked out of the shadow of absence and into the fluorescent clarity of a small community gas station. He smelled of woods and something that patients of hospitals sometimes carry, sterile, hard to name. His clothing was the same, his nervousness the same. He looked like a man who had been given back to an orbit he no longer quite fit. He spoke in short bursts. Grant Walton, his brother, saw him and went toward him with the slow, bewildered gait of a man trying to hold a tiger that has come in from the cold. Nothing matched the gap that the 5 days had made. Medical exams followed. Doctors who had seen many kinds of trauma looked for cuts, for signs of infection, for metabolic disturbance, and found mostly a list of anomalies that made clinical notes sound like metaphors. Dehydration and a sleep-worn hollow in the eyes. A pulse that shook like a line of tremors. They asked questions about memory. Travis described one thing, and then
another flashes of interiors, of creatures who watched him with large dark eyes, of a taller figure in a blue uniform who moved like someone with a script to follow. He used words like paralysis and numbness, describing the sensations as if assigning names to tides. He did not, they recorded, describe anything like gore. The interviews were careful and, at times, incredulous in their tenderness. The sheriff and the deputies moved through their responsibilities, which, in a small county, meant both civic care and the hard edge of skepticism. Marlon Gillespie, sheriff, and Deputy Chuck Ellison stood between community outrage and the machinery of inquiry. They organized search parties and documented the scene with the plainness of law. Soil was collected, photographs were taken. The men who had been with Travis underwent polygraph tests. The devices themselves carried an era's faith in instrumented truth. Some of the crew gave statements that showed small divergences, time estimates, angles of light, but all agreed on a center, that a beam had hit and that Travis had vanished. The polygraph charts, when later spoken of in public, were reported as having offered corroboration that these men believed the story they told. Meanwhile, reporters arrived with microphones and notebooks and the eager, clinical eye of strangers for whom the edge of fear often makes good copy. Photographs of the crew circulated, faces that had been ordinary elbowed into public significance. Some neighbors were supportive, others recoiled. The town's social calculus adjusted. Curiosity here, ridicule there, prayers at kitchen tables, late-night talk at the station. For Travis, the world had shifted from a place where his identity was measurable by work hours and friendships to one keyed to a story that would not leave him alone. He returned to interviews that felt like exams. Investigators asked him to recount times and sequences. He tried, with the blunt instrument of language, to lay out a sequence in which time itself had been porous. He spoke of being carried down a tunnel of brightness into a chamber that suggested manufacture. Curved surfaces, panels that sang under fingertips, a scent like cold metal and faint ozone. The beings were there. No amount of investigation could make them wholly legible. Some were small and pale with eyes too large for their faces, so dark they read like wells. Another was taller, with hair the color of bleached wheat and skin that, seen in the sterile light, had a human quality. This taller figure moved with deliberation and wore a uniform of blue fabric that hung with a narrow severity. Doctors and investigators watched his hands as he spoke. When he described being examined, his language smoothed into clinical observation. "They put a light over my eyes," he said. "They didn't hurt me. It felt like being checked at a factory line, only I was the product." He remembered colors and a hum, a vibration that settled into his bones. He remembered a sense of being prodded and of instruments that betrayed no.
"It wasn't like being cut," he told one reporter. "It was like being looked through." He could not make the verbs of it fit neatly into a narrative that matched ordinary cruelty or ordinary kindness. The language in which humans record suffering was awkward here, like fitting a square peg into a round hole. The polygraph examinations of the crew were followed by public attention and by a slate of contradictory testimonies and interpretations. In a town the size of Snowflake, with lines between families and histories drawn in known ways, loyalty and doubt were both currencies. Some of Travis's co-workers stood by him with the stubbornness of those who had seen the rawness of tree trunks and the tilt of the road. Others, under pressure and under the weight of community suspicion, wavered in small ways. The sheriff's office filed its reports, volunteers pressed on toward the clearing again and again. Photographs of the supposed marks at the site circulated through newsprint, their grainy quality a kind of proof for those who wanted images to hold. As medical and legal scrutiny circled, Travis lived inside memory and outside it simultaneously. He could recall fragments, the way fluorescent panels hummed against the taste of copper in the mouth, the smallness of the creature's fingers, and he could not recall where time had gone between disappearance and reappearance. Occasionally, in interviews, he would let slip a detail that did not fit easy skepticism, a sense of something like technology that was not ours, and simultaneously a sensation of being part of an experiment. He said he felt paralyzed during the event, lifted into a space where his muscles no longer obeyed, watched by beings whose faces seemed to hold a question rather than an answer. The townspeople did not always separate witness from story. Newspapers printed columns with headlines that felt like verdicts. Late-night radio hosts turned the case into a riddle to be solved in less time than it takes to dig beneath a site. Some locals kept their counsel and folded the event into other unanswerables of the West, strange lights at the edge of town, lost hikers who returned with altered eyes. Others whispered that the men had staged something for attention or profit. Conspiracy is a narrative the human mind spins to keep discomfort at bay. The crew felt the pressure. They had to live alongside their own account being picked apart by cameras and by the curious. Men who used to pass the time with jokes now found themselves practicing statements to the sheriff like actors rehearsing lines they would rather not perform. Travis slept little. When sleep came, it came with images that refused the language of dreams and bled into nightmares. He spoke later of waking with the sensation of an arm across him, of a grip that belonged to a place that was not human. He flinched at low humming sounds in machinery, at the distant moan of a transformer at night. His appetite dulled.
The world around food and mechanics held less purchase. He stopped going out with the crew for a while, staying home, where Grant and his parents tried to provide an anchor that was, in truth, hard to be. The label that followed him, the man who vanished, settled into small irritations. Strangers' stares, jokes that were never really jokes, invitations withdrawn. Over the months that followed, investigators from larger circles came and went. Amateur researchers came with measuring devices and earnest flyers. A few scientists took interest at the margins, analyzing soil samples for anomalies and reporting results in a cautious, academic tone that offered little in the way of certitude and much in the way of technical curiosity. They recorded elevated traces here and there. Nothing definitive emerged that would fold the event into the book of known phenomena. The polygraph results and witness statements were arrayed like a tableau for anyone wanting to draw a conclusion. Each element could be read as corroboration or as a hole in the other theory. Travis found himself traveling in a way he had not expected, to conferences where people argued in slow, earnest cadences about evidence and faith, to small rooms where men who had been through similar experiences compared notes like veterans examining old maps. He sat in a chair beneath fluorescent lights while strangers asked him about panels and probes, about faces and the taste of metal. Sometimes in those rooms, he met men and women with similar stories, vanished and reappeared, touched and altered. They spoke of isolation, of being treated as a curiosity, and of the strange companionship that can arise among those who share an event the rest of their lives will call impossible. At home with his family, he tried to stitch himself back into ordinary rhythms. Wood needed cutting, and fences needed mending, and the land did not ask for testimony. Yet every ordinary action carried an extra weight. Eyes that watched it work, a handshake that meant so much more than it should. The questions inside him were not rhetorical. They clung like burrs. Had he been chosen? Had he been examined? Had the beings been curious, clinical, benign, or indifferent? His answers to those questions shifted depending on the hour and the company. Sometimes he was certain they had not meant harm. Other times, feeling the authoritarian chill of being unable to defend his body against examination, he felt something deeper and more troubling. The longer arc of the case curved into reputation and memory. The crew's cohesion frayed in small, predictable ways. Conversations that once ended in shared jokes now brushed over the subject like a scar. Men moved jobs or towns. Others persevered in small acts of loyalty. Mike Rogers, the man who had been driving that night, found himself both accused and defended in the public paper, his name a pivot in the town's verdicts. Grant Walton held to a brother as best he could, an anchor in a community that could be brittle.
Years later, the clearing itself became a kind of pilgrimage site for some. People drove out on moonless nights and parked beneath the indifferent sky, cameras poised. Some left offerings, a cigarette butt, a coin. For Travis, revisiting the place was less about spectacle and more about a ritual of settling his own interior compass. He stood in the center and let his palms find the crushed pine needles. The hum he had once felt was now something he could call up with a breath, like recalling a smell. He watched the stars. Their cold light made the earth seem like a thin skin separating him from a vast, indifferent expanse. Skepticism never disappeared, and for good reasons. Memory is pliant, social pressure can reshape testimony, and the machinery of proof is reluctant to accept stories that break the ordinary rules. Yet the case held stubborn facts: the date in November, the 5 days of absence, the phone call at a payphone, the sequence of investigative actions by Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Deputy Chuck Ellison, the polygraph examinations of the crew, and the mix of medical findings that recorded anomaly without explanation. These facts formed a lattice between which every interpretation had to hang. Interviews recorded later in life showed Travis seated with the care of a man narrating an event he had been given back from the dark. He would sometimes laugh in a way that betrayed a man who knew when amusement was a tool for survival. "It's been the hardest thing," he said in one taped conversation, "to be believable and to be myself at the same time." He spoke about the strange intimacy of being studied and about the cruelty of being doubted by people whose regard mattered. Yet within that ache was also the residue of awe. He admitted that sometimes, when a northern wind came down from the mountains and the pines sang a certain resonance, he remembered the rounded wall and the soft blue light, as if recalling the face of a thing that, in its own way, had been curious about him. People continue to argue about motive and meaning. Some insisted on trickery, some on hysteria, some on the mechanical errors of memory. Others catalogued the phenomenon as another item in a world where strange things occur unaccountably. The balance between the clinical reports and the subjective experience is a thin rope walked by those who approach the case. On one side sits the demand for replicable evidence, on the other the testimony of a man who lived through an event that did not afford him explanation. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the night in the clearing was not the debate, but the change it made in the inner geography of a life. Where Travis had once been defined by work rhythms and a practical outlook, he found himself living inside a question that had no tidy resolution. He learned over time to speak about it in a way that honored both the witnesses who stood by him and the intelligence of those who doubted. He accepted that his story would become a kind of mirror in which strangers could see their own anxieties about the universe, its size, its indifference, the possibility that it included things that behaved by laws they had not yet named. In quiet hours, he would drive out to the clearing and sit on the hood of a truck, the same vehicle noise now a companion to memory. He would look up at the stars and remember the sensation of being lifted and studied, and though he could rarely fold that memory into a single meaning, a sense remained. The universe was more than the sum of his habits, and in that surplus there was both terror and a strange, patient beauty. Investigators continued to archive their records, photos, polygraph charts, typed statements. The public consumed the file like a novel, each reader choosing the ending that best fit their particular appetite for belief or skepticism. Yet for those present that night, the men who had gone to work with calloused hands and returned with their lives altered, the event was not an abstract object of curiosity. It was a lived breach. It required, in its aftermath, the slow work of healing, explanation, and the negotiation of reputation. The narrative that formed around that breach was messy, human, and unresolved. Years later, Travis would meet a reporter who asked him whether he ever wished he had never gone near the light. He considered the question with the gravity of someone assessing a scar. "No," he said slowly, "because I didn't ask for it, but I also can't unsee what I saw. I can't take back what happened to me. I can only live with it, find a way to be a man who keeps working, keeps loving, keeps being present in the world that raised me." He spoke of an odd tenderness he felt for the beings, not an affection, but a human empathy for otherness. He did not claim to have answers. He offered, instead, the quiet testimony of someone who had been altered by an encounter that had not resolved into a sermon or a spectacle. In the end, the clearing remained a threshold in his life, A place where ordinary things had ceased to hold their usual weight, and where something larger than expectation had reached down into the world of men. The record, medical notes, sheriff's reports, polygraph charts, press clippings, and the memory of friends and neighbors held the shape of a story that refused to sit comfortably in any single dogma. The truth, insofar as a truth could be assembled in such matters, was a composite of hard facts and open human questions. When he returned to the clearing at dusk, the pines stood the same, indifferent to human histories. The air carried the smell of resin and the distant metallic tang of a world that was indifferent and immense. He cupped his hands around a cigarette and let the smoke climb and blur the evening. Above him, the stars climb and blur the evening. Above him, the stars glinted like cold promises. He thought of the tall figure in the blue uniform, of the small, pale ones with their dark eyes, of the clinical hum that had once encoded his body into a new set of memories. He did not expect anyone to believe him. He did not ask it. He listened instead to the quiet, an ordinary sound that, perhaps, could hold the residue of wonder. He thought about living with not knowing, and concluded that to keep living was, in itself, a kind of answer. The record would continue to be sifted, debated, and catalogued. He would give interviews and attend meetings, sleep badly, and sometimes laugh with men who had once been his crew. But on certain nights, when the wind came down from the mountains and the world folded into itself under the stars, he walked out to the clearing, let the pine needles grind under his boots, and watched the sky. In that watching there was grief and a kind of wary peace, the peace of a man who had seen something that could not be owned by explanation, and who, defiant of easy closure, held his life open to mystery. He stood there until the cigarette burned low and the last orange ember sank into ash. The wind moved through the pines like a hand over a coarse cloth, and the clearing kept its patient silence. When he turned to go, the path home felt longer than it had when he was young. The world seemed to hold its breath in that stretch between the trees and the road, as if awaiting something that might not come. He walked anyway, because walking had always been the way he let time do its work. In town, the story had folded into ordinary life with the stubbornness of old weather. Newcomers asked about it at the diner. Teenagers dared one another to spend an hour beneath the pines with flashlights. A woman had painted a mural on the side of a feed store, showing a small figure against a sky of rings and stars. A shop on Main sold T-shirts with the clearing's coordinates, as if coordinates could stand in for meaning. A local pastor preached about fear and wonder in the same breath, and then made coffee for the men who came by after. All of it made the event a public artifact, something that could be bought or argued about or worn. None of it reached the place where the men had lived the thing. Travis took his place in the ordinary. He drove the same routes, hauled the same materials, mended what needed mending. He learned to answer questions with short sentences and a look that suggested both refusal and permission. He learned when to speak and when to let the blank expression do the work of a closed door. He learned to keep his children close in the small, practical ways that make love visible. Fish on a Saturday, a truck ride with the windows down, a hand on a shoulder when a teenager returns late. Love, in its steadiness, felt like a remedy he could trust. There were nights when the past tilted forward and would not be denied. In those hours, he sometimes called a man named Jim, calloused hands, who had been there the night the light rose, and they would sit on a pickup tailgate and talk of the weather, the bills, the small humiliations of getting older. They never recreated the scene. They did not need to. The memory was an ache they carried in a way that made them careful with one another. Jim kept a jar of coins in his garage, a habit he said came from a time before the light, when saving meant something that could be counted. After the light, Jim's coins stayed, but the habit had a different cast. It was a ritual to remember the contingency of things. Then, one October afternoon, a message arrived that braided curiosity with the old protocols of evidence. It came in a neat, clinical hand. Dr. Naomi Sinclair, formerly with the state laboratory, asking if he might meet her in town. Naomi had been present in the days after the event. Her name appeared in reports and footnotes, but she'd retreated into a life of quiet laboratory work. He remembered her as a woman whose face never quite let astonishment be the same as commission. He said yes. They met at a booth in a diner, the place that felt neutral, with its vinyl and coffee that never quite cooled. Naomi sat with a small envelope beside her coffee, the sort that suggested a file rather than a surprise. She did not theatrically unfold it. She slipped it across the table with the efficiency of someone used to handling fragile things. "I've been rereading the samples," she said. Her voice had the careful cadence of someone who had spent years translating the world into charts and margins. "Not to confirm a hypothesis, there are plenty of those already. I wanted to see what the material would say to a different sort of listening." He watched her hands. They were clean, practical hands. He remembered the smell of the lab pen, an antiseptic, a bright, cutting ozone. It now felt like a memory from another skin. "What did it say?" Travis asked. Naomi hesitated the way people do when they are deciding how much to wear and how much to leave private. "There's something in the residue that doesn't match known industrial alloys. The isotopic ratios are odd. Not impossible, just not what you'd expect from mining or meteorite fragments. I sent a portion to a colleague at a university and asked them to run an independent panel. They found similar anomalies." Travis kept his face still. Evidence, he had learned, was a double-edged thing. It could set him free from skepticism, or it could drag him back into the business of being a spectacle. He thought of the tall figure, of the patient way it had looked at them, and a part of him bristled at the idea of that gaze being caught and sold. "Do you want me to publish?" Naomi asked. "Do you want to reopen this?" He considered the question as if it were a fuse with a visible length. "No," he said finally. "Not like that. Not a press conference. Not to answer every idiot who calls me on the phone at 2 a.m. Naomi's features shifted, an expression that held sympathy, but also the stubbornness of someone who believed the pursuit of knowledge had its own moral center. "I thought you might say that. The panel wants to present peer-reviewed data, but that's not the same as spectacle. Peer review is a process. There are safeguards." "They'll still want you to stand behind it," he said. "You'll be the woman in the lab who brought us back into that light." Her lips curved. Maybe I'm used to that. But I'm also—" She paused, searching for a word that had been eroded by bureaucracy and retelling. "Tired of leaving things unexplained for the sake of people who loudly prefer their ignorance." He thought of the piles of reports, of typed statements and photographs kept in boxes in municipal storage. He thought about the men who had wrestled with their sleep, and the neighbors who had added their interpretations like new wallpaper. He thought of being forced, repeatedly, to prove himself to people who wanted to put him into one theory or another. "Why now?" he asked. Naomi looked out the window at the street where nothing remarkable happened. "Because some of the technology has improved. Because my colleague believed the ratios were worth a second look. Because I've been carrying this in my head for years and it keeps waking me up. Because I keep thinking about what we owe the men who were there." Outside, a dog walked by on a leash. A child on a bicycle passed, doing one of those loops that always ends in the same place. The diner hummed. People bent into their own small dramas. Naomi folded her hands on the table. "I don't want to make you a figure," she said. "If you would rather we kept the samples anonymous, I can anonymize. If you want to refuse, that's your right. I can present the data without naming the witnesses." He laughed, a small, dry sound. "You scientists always think anonymity will silence the messiness of human life." "Maybe we fool ourselves," she said. "But there's a difference between sponsoring curiosity and creating a circus." He swallowed. The world had taught him to mistrust rescue. Rescue often carried with it an expectation of performance. But there was also a pull, call it duty or perhaps a desire for accuracy, that ran under his refusal. He had promised himself in the immediate years after the event that he would keep his life from being swallowed by it.
But there were obligations he had not accounted for then, to the men who had been altered, to the truth of what had happened to them as something more than rumor. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Permission to test more," she said. "And, if you are willing, to allow a small, private meeting in the clearing. Not a press event, not a reenactment. Just the witnesses, maybe a scientist or two, and enough time to see if the site yields anything now. Sometimes the ground remembers." He pictured the pines in winter, their needles like a green lake, their roots anchored in soil that did not move for small human things. The idea of returning in a controlled way felt less like surrender than it did like a ritual, an attempt to treat the clearing as a place with claims rather than as a myth to be debated. He thought of Jim's coins, of his daughter's steady hand folding clothes, of Naomi's small, determined kindness. He surprised himself by nodding. "All right," he said, "but small, respectful, no cameras." Naomi's relief was immediate but guarded. "No cameras," she repeated, "just the group. We'll document it in the way a scientist must, but we'll keep the focus on what is there, not on making a show." They agreed on a night that was neither too cold nor too crowded in terms of the calendars of the small town. Word of the meeting did not reach the feed store or the t-shirt seller. It remained an arrangement between people who had been there and people who believed in a cautious curiosity. Travis told his family with the same economy he used in other things. His daughter pressed her palms to his arm and said nothing. She had always been more inclined to believe him in the way children sometimes do, simply without needing to posture or explain. His son, who wanted to be a carpenter, shrugged and said, "You coming back safe is the part I like best. Don't make it weird." He meant it as a joke, but the tenderness in his voice was a net. The clearing that night was quieter than he remembered, as if the earth itself had grown modest with time. A handful of men sat on overturned buckets. Naomi arrived carrying a small kit, sampling vials, gloves, a lamp that had the clean white of a surgical room. They had asked the sheriff to have someone stand by at the periphery, not to guard the site so much as to prevent intrusion. The sheriff took his place beneath a tree and smoked like someone who believed tobacco steadied the nerves. The stars were more indifferent than ever. The Milky Way dusted the sky with the kind of depth that makes human affairs feel, for a moment, like a small choreography. They walked the old path with lanterns and the careful steps of people who do not want to disturb.
An old wound. Naomi moved like a person translating everything into a sequence of tasks. A grid here, a shallow scrape there, notes the way a priest might keep a ritual ledger. Travis followed with one hand in his coat pocket, feeling the familiar hardness of a stone he kept from childhood. He had always carried stones, small tokens of groundedness. Tonight the habit felt necessary. For a long time, nothing happened. Naomi took samples from the soil and from a ring of crushed needles where their boots had once burned the pattern into the earth. The men watched, their faces marked by the patient erasure of time. Conversation drifted toward weather and the mechanics of old trucks. The routine talk was a kind of shelter. Late in the night, when the lantern light had become a small, tidy thing, Naomi called them together to show a reading. A faint anomaly on a handheld spectrometer that she had not expected to appear on site. It was small, a whisper at the edge of the instrument's range, but it was there. She repeated the test, methodical as ritual, and the reading hummed the same small tone. "It could be noise," she said. "Instruments pick up ghost frequencies sometimes, but we've run it 3 times." Silence followed the sentence. Silence was a friend here. It allowed the shape of things to settle. Travis felt the old, complex ache, part fear, part curiosity, thread into his chest. He did not want miracles for himself. He wanted steadiness. He did not want to be consumed by noise. But there was a small, electric part of him that still wanted the world to be larger than the rectangles into which people place their days. A wind moved through the pines,
and with it came a sound like a low, mechanical sigh. It was not a whistle or a human noise. It had the quality of something steady and patient. The men listened as if listening could alter its character. For a moment, Naomi's hand trembled on the spectrometer. The light on the screen wavered. From the dark at the edge of the clearing, something rose. Not the vivid, searing column from the years before, but a distant, cool glow that seemed to congeal between the trunks. It was small, a wash of pale blue that made the bark look silver, and it moved as if a current had taken hold of it. The hairs on the back of Travis's neck stood up. He could have sworn, in the hush, that something watched them through the needles. No one spoke. Jim, who rarely showed fright in the conventional ways, he was a man formed of stoic bricks, set his jaw and spat like a man who would not yield to tremor. Naomi took out a small light and trained it toward the glow, and then turned it off. The glow did not flare away. It held its shape and, in doing so, made the familiar forest look newly strange. Then, a small
scent rose, something metallic and sweet, like the smell that had anchored his memory years before, and the spot at the edge of the clearing shivered as if something had walked through it. A pebble slid across a bed of needles, catching the lamplight and revealing itself to be a dark, almost glassy stone. It moved with a slow deliberation and stopped near Travis's boot. Without thinking, he crouched and picked it up. The pebble was warm. Its surface held a fine, almost imperceptible pattern like concentric rings. He turned it over in his palm and did not feel the weight of ordinary rock. There was a small, humming calm in it, like the impression of a note you nearly remember. "Careful," Naomi said softly. Her voice had the low, attentive quality of someone who had been taught not to make sudden moves in strange rooms. Travis put the pebble into his pocket. He did not know what he planned to do with it. He only knew that, for a second, the world had shifted. Not catastrophically, not in a way that demanded a new religion, but enough to remind him that the clearing was not merely a place of memory. It was, still, a place that could make claims on the body and the attention. They stayed a while longer, letting the glow thin and reform like a slow breath. When it finally receded into the dark and the pines resumed their usual opacity, the group rose and walked back in pairs and single steps, as if emerging from a sleep that required small stabilizing acts. Naomi took careful notes and sealed the vials with a hand that trembled only a little. Jim spoke of nothing of consequence. The sheriff lit another cigarette and looked toward the highway. The world outside the clearing remained the noisy, ordinary one. A pickup sound, a distant dog, the soft neon of a gas station. On the drive home, with the pebble in his pocket, Travis felt a tiredness that was not simply physical. It had weight and an odd gratitude. The pebble's warmth against his thigh made him think of the tall figure's hands, if it had hands, and of the curious tenderness he had felt, years before, toward otherness. He thought of Naomi's workbench, clean with instruments, and of Jim's coins, kept for a reason that had nothing to do with lore. He thought of the way the town had learned, in its small ways, to wear the story like weather. At his door his daughter waited. She was barefoot, hair still damp from the bath she had taken in anticipation of a father who sometimes returned with stories. He sat on the stoop and told her nothing substantial, only that he had been where he belonged and that the night had been quiet. And her small hand folded over his like a small, exact reconciliation. He kept the pebble, and in doing so, accepted a new and private fact. There were things that could not be reduced. Files or to the crude appetites of speculation. There were, too, things that did not require answers to be meaningful. The pebble's presence was a companionable secret. It did not explain. It suggested. It asked for the simple work of keeping faith with the small truths of a life, to keep showing up, to hold family, to let mystery remain a neighbor rather than a commodity. In the days that followed, Naomi published cautiously, a short paper in a modest journal, peer-reviewed and careful in its phrasing. The town heard about it in waves, a headline here, a conservative blog post there. The national press did not descend. That absence felt like mercy. The men who went to the clearing together were satisfied that they had done something respectful. People read the paper and argued about it in forums where argument was itself its own pleasure. Conspiracy theorists circulated their versions. Skeptics wrote their rebuttals. Life went on in its stubborn, ordinary way. Travis returned occasionally to the clearing on his own. The pebbles stayed in his pocket like a warm, quiet truth. Sometimes, late at night when the children were asleep and the house breathed in the soft rhythms of domestic life, he would take the pebble out and roll it between his fingers, and think of the tall figure and the small, pale ones with dark eyes. He did not desire explanation as one desires a chart to be filled in. He desired something softer, the ability to hold wonder and grief at once, to live as a man who could be fully present to the people around him, and also to the larger, stranger pulses the universe sometimes offered. He had not expected closure. He had not expected a tidy ending, any more than he had expected an answer. What he had found, over the years, was a way of being that could live with questions. He learned to answer when children asked him if the stars were alive, to say yes and mean not a scientific claim, but a tenderness, that the sky held more than we could measure, and that this excess called for humility. He also learned to repair what needed repair, to show up at school plays, to fix a roof, to be present when a friend died. The pebble, tucked now in the back pocket of his jeans, warmed against him as he walked the town. On one ordinary morning, he stopped at the corner where the mural had been painted. A small boy pointed to it with the blunt confidence of a child, and his mother, polite and wary, pulled him onward. Travis watched them go and felt, briefly, like someone who had been given the chance to keep a private covenant with the world, half witness, half gardener. He reached into his pocket and closed his fingers around the pebble, as if making a pledge. The rest of the day waited, full of small tasks, and he walked towards them with the steady patience of a man who had learned that some mysteries don't need owning to be beautiful.